If you are a short-term rental operator, this video is going to be one of the most important videos you watch because I'm going to give you some trends and statistics that you need to be aware of going into the summer of 2024, especially if you want to be competitive and stay in this game for the long haul. There's going to be some big changes. We're seeing some trends that are positive and some trends that are negative, and you need to be aware of these trends. Let's get right into it, and let's talk first about 2023 and how 2023 is going to help us predict what's going to happen in 2024. The first quarter of 2024 is over, so some of the stuff that I mentioned, there's a video that I did last year or in January of 2023 talking about some of the trends of 2024. In that video, I talked about a lot of what I'm going to talk about in this video because what I mentioned there is coming true in 2024. First of all, let's talk about 2023. As I mentioned, there was a lot of people that were claiming the death of Airbnb and the end of the short-term rental industry. That turned out not to be true. In fact, the opposite happened. Although some of the negative trends that I'm going to talk about here sadly will affect us, but there's opportunity for us to stop some of the negative stuff that's going on and hopefully reverse it so that we don't see some of the stuff that I'm starting to see now. Let's just talk about some stats, right? As I mentioned in that January video, I mentioned that 2023 was a phenomenal year for the short-term rental industry as it relates to growth and revenue. It was great for companies like Airbnb, Booking.com, OTA companies. It was also very, very good for companies like mine, in which we have a large portfolio and a large footprint. And we always stay proactive. It was horrible for the mom and pop hosts, people that only have one or two properties, and even worse for those of you that got lazy during the peak of, let's say, during the what I refer to as the boom artificial growth of the short-term rental industry during and post-pandemic. Let me just give you some numbers in terms of growing demand in the US as it relates to short-term rental. In 2023, there were $64 billion in revenue came in, which was the highest ever for short-term rentals. In addition, there were 24 million nights stayed. July of 2023 was the highest month in record. Now, if you follow this channel, you know that I always tell people this. Some of you guys get surprised when I mention this. July is the most traveled month worldwide. Most people go on vacation or they travel during the month of July. So it was no surprise when I saw this statistic come out, or no surprise to me when I saw this come out, as July being a record month in terms of revenue and stays for the short-term rental industry. But here's the negative. There were 1.6 million available listings in September of that month, which was also a record, right? Some of you guys that lost money in the the latter half of 2023 lost money because you're probably in an area where there was an oversaturation in the market. And as I mentioned, some of you guys didn't adapt to that oversaturation and didn't figure out how to maximize and optimize your listing so that you stood out and that potential guests picked your property over the next. The other thing let's talk about in terms of 2023 was the fact that in the latter half, we also saw a demand in terms of spending power especially in the US economy. That was last year. I'm talking about last year, not talking about this year, right? So there was an increase, and there was a lot of people spending money in 2023 in travel. That's important to understand. Here's what happened. Here's some of the negatives, right? Towards the latter part of 2023, going into 2024, we saw an end of the inflated COVID boom. Just talked about that I never used the numbers that I saw right after COVID because those were anomalies. We're never going to go back to those numbers, or at least it's going to be a long time before we go back to those numbers because those numbers were inflated. During that time, there weren't as many short-term rentals available. A lot of people did not want to stay in hotels. In fact, some hotels were even closed. And if you were in Florida like I was, Florida during the pandemic was one of the few states open, one of the few states that didn't go through the BS that we saw in states like New York, Chicago, all these states that had really restrictive regulations as it relates to COVID. If you were in Florida and some of the destinations that were more liberal, you saw a huge boom during that time. Again, those numbers were inflated. Part of 2023 and going into 2024, those numbers, or those inflated numbers, are over. We're back to reality. Let's talk about some of the challenges and some of the stuff that I'm seeing is very, very important that you understand. The first one is increased regulation. We're seeing this all over the world, right? Today, everybody is doing some type, or every city, every government entity is implementing some kind of regulation. And some of it is flat out super restrictive. Here's what government agencies are not doing, right? They learned from other cities that attempted to totally ban Airbnbs and they lost in court, right? You're never going to see a total ban, but you're going to see some restrictions that make it impossible for you to operate. I'm going to give you an example. New York City. New York City, it's almost impossible to run a short-term rental because of the restrictions are so restrictive that it's not viable for you to be there and operate as a short-term rental operator. There's a big scary one for me that I'm really, really paying attention to, and that is the state of Hawaii. The state of Hawaii, there's some bills in place in which, again, they're trying to not flat out ban short-term rentals, but they're definitely going to be the most restrictive regulations, more restrictive than New York. That is scary, people, and hopefully it doesn't happen, but we're seeing it. You really need to be prepared for these regulations to happen. For example, if you own a short-term rental and your property is not to code, if you're not running it professionally, because this is where we're getting in trouble, right? We're getting in trouble because a lot of you guys are being lazy, a lot of you guys are not being professional, and you're allowing things like parties to happen in your short-term rental. Let's talk about what's happening in Colombia, especially if you follow my channel. In Colombia, there's been a huge crackdown because of sex trafficking, right? A lot of countries like Colombia, I'll mention Thailand, I'll mention Singapore, some areas in which the sex trade is legal. People go there specifically to do those kind of things. You're a short-term rental operator, don't allow that stuff to happen in your property, people, because bad things are going to happen, and they're not going to single out that bad host. They're going to say, we're all doing that. It's going to affect all of us in the long run. So be professional, regulate yourself so you don't have government coming in and regulating you, because you're not going to want that. They're going to be much more restrictive. It's going to cost you money because at the end of the day, they're going to want you to pay ridiculous fees and licensing, etc. So understand that that's going to be a huge problem. Really follow what's going on in Hawaii, because that's going to set a precedent. So for example, I just mentioned New York City, New Orleans, Maui, Philly. They all last year and part of this year implemented regulations that's super restrictive and is killing the short-term rental market in those areas. And if you're not in those areas, again, do yourself a big favor. Get together with other hosts. Make sure you guys are doing the right thing. Make sure you guys are being professional. I'm gonna beat this to death because it's really going to affect all of us. So let's just be on top of that.